Hello, everyone. Welcome to Book Talk with Cara. And this week, I'm so excited to introduce you to my friend, Jocelyn Green. I think you are going to love the opportunity to get to know more about her. She's a fellow Midwesterner, and she writes wonderful historical fiction. And she's written lots of time periods. So Civil War, but her most recent series is set in like the 1915s around the Chicago World's Fair. And this is the one that came out last year, and then another one just released. And so we're going to talk about her books, her writing. Yeah, she's got the beautiful cover there, and all just the fun of how she comes up with her stories and things like that. So I'm so glad you're here. And I'm going to have Jocelyn introduce herself and just tell us more about you and what you're writing, Jocelyn.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me, Cara. This is so much fun. Let's see, you've covered the basics. My name is Jocelyn. I write historical fiction, and I'm glad that you said historical fiction because I don't consider myself a romance writer. So historical romance would be something that other people do really, really well. There is some romance in the things that I write, but it's definitely not, it's not that genre. It's not the main point of the plot. I live in the Midwest. It's cold right now. It's going to be 1 degree tomorrow. I mean, what is the point of 1 degree? It's just impossible. I have 2 kids. My son is 13 and my daughter is 15. My husband happens to be the mayor of our town for right now. So
that's so fun.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's kind of fun is maybe not the right word for anyone in leadership these days, but it is an honor and he is happy to serve the community. Whenever people say something like, oh, he's a politician, I'm always like, no, he's a public servant. So we keep pretty busy here in Cedar Falls, Iowa, and I'm so thankful that writing books gets to take me to all different kinds of places and time periods. That is so much fun. I love to read novels, especially historical ones. And probably like many of you, I have relied on them for my armchair travel, like letting the books take me around to different places when we couldn't actually go there in person, but it's a lot of fun.
That is awesome. And, I think there really is something about being able to escape in a book right now. We've had 2 years that have been chaotic. I think we're all like, okay, any day now, let's get back to normal. And we don't know when that's going to be. And so that's where books play such an important role in helping us kind of get outside of our little bubble that either we've chosen or has been kind of imposed on us. So tell us about your books. Like your most recent ones are like traveling back in time to Chicago. So in like a minute or two, tell us about this series and how you got the idea, and then we'll dig into the books, the individual books.
Okay, no problem. Well, it's called the Windy City Saga, and the first book is called Veiled in Smoke, and it's set in 1871 during and after the Great Chicago Fire. So these books are actually spread out. There's like 22 years that elapses between the start of each story because I wanted to hit major historical events in the city of Chicago. So the way that we organized it was to follow one family, and it's like 3 generations. And they're a bookstore owning family, which is lots of fun. So the first protagonist, her name is Meg, and her little sister, Sylvie, gets her own story in Shadows of the White City in 1893 during the World's Fair. And this protagonist is 43 years old at the start of the story, which was great because I was 43 when I wrote it. And Cara, when we write novels, a lot of times the young whippersnappers get all the leading roles, right?
That's so true.
It was really fun to write a single middle-aged female protagonist.
And I love, just to hit on that a little bit, I loved in that book how there wasn't really a romance. There was a little hint maybe that something could happen, but that wasn't the point of the book. I mean, it was all about what happened in the fair, and I don't want to give it away, but it was so much more than that. And Flight Risk for me was my book with a 40-year-old heroine. And you're right, it was just fun to be able to slip out of those, if you're historical early 20s, if you're contemporary late 20s, into a different time period for the heroine in their life.
Yes, yes. So I should mention, as long as we're talking about Shadows of the White City, a lot of people have read the nonfiction book Devil in the White City by Eric Larson. And so they hear White City and they're like, oh, are you writing about H.H. Holmes, America's first serial killer? And my answer is no. That is not the type of book that I write. But it's on the back of the book, so I don't think it's giving anything away. But she has adopted a daughter, and in this story, she is a teenager, and she goes missing during the World's Fair. H.H. Holmes did not get her. Don't worry, it's not that type of a story. But yeah, so the plot revolves around finding her, and there are some overlap characters.
That is so funny, because when I read it and I was seeing what happened to her daughter, I was like, oh no. Did the serial killer get her?
I know. And even when I was plotting this with my editors, we were sitting around a table. I was in Minneapolis at Bethany House, and everyone was like, they're going to go to H.H. Holmes. They're just going to think that that's what happened. But you know how it is when you write a book, whatever you write about, you have to dwell in that stuff, in that research for months and months on end. And I just couldn't do that. And I don't think that people who have read my book so far would expect that. I think from certain other authors, and there is a lot to be said about meeting the expectations of your readers.
Absolutely.
There have been a couple of times when I have surprised readers, and I stand by my choices, but sometimes, either readers will love it or hate it when you do that. But for my own sake, I wasn't willing to go to the serial killer for that story.
Well, and it's a gripping story without that. And this is from the person who writes romantic suspense. And so, but I was like, oh, it can't go there. I wasn't expecting that. And then it doesn't. And so you're right. It's all about what you write and what your readers expect. And I wouldn't have expected that from your book, but it's just funny that you're all like, well, readers could go here. Yeah, this reader did. And I was glad you didn't.
Yeah. That's right. And then the third book in the series is called Drawn by the Current. And it releases February 1st, which is that next week? I feel like it's next week.
It is. So y'all are hearing about it here first.
Yes.
You still have time to pre-order it.
You have time to pre-order it. And I will just say, the best deal that I have found is at bakerbookhouse.com. It's 40% off and free shipping. So Drawn by the Current.
They do amazing pre-order specials. I love doing that. And then it's like, I'll go in like 3 times a year and do a whole bunch of pre-orders. And then it's like Christmas multiple times a year in my mailbox, because of course I forgot I pre-ordered it. So it's awesome.
I have gotten I've gotten some duplicates because of forgetting that I pre-order, but that's fine because, I always know what to do with extra books. But in this story, the protagonist's name is Olive, and she's the daughter of the protagonist of the first book. And she is an insurance agent for MetLife. And the story in Drawn by the Current, the inciting incident, is this kind of lesser known historical event in Chicago history and in maritime history called the Eastland disaster. And you probably can't see it, but on the cover is this ship, and this was the SS. And on July 24th, 1915, it was in the Chicago River. It had 2,500 passengers on board. They were mostly employees of the Western Electric plant, and they were getting ready to go on their company picnic across the tip of Lake Michigan to Michigan City, Indiana. And the ship tipped over in the river. It didn't capsize, it just tipped over, and people were trapped inside, and 844 people died. It is so tragic, and hardly anybody knows about it.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I told you a minute ago, I was
mhm.
literally, just kind of looking up the book and I was like, what? And then I dug deeper and I was like, oh my gosh, in some ways, the tragedy is a response to the Titanic, where legislators were trying to fix a problem and there was more going on, but it was like, oh my goodness, how have I never heard of this? And that's my
Mhm.
favorite part about historical fiction, is when you as an author turn me on to a piece of history I had no idea about. So how did you discover this tidbit?
Oh, that's my favorite kind of thing to write about too. I think I probably discovered it because my editor asked if I would consider writing a series. And he said, how about something in the Midwest? And I thought, great, that'll be easier for me to research because I live here. So, of course, Chicago. And I knew about the Great Fire. I knew about the World's Fair, but a series is not as well. I guess you could have a series of two. It's like a duology or something, but I needed that third thing. So I just Googled like major events in Chicago history and I found this and I had the same reaction like, what happened?
Yeah.
Why have I never heard about this before? But I think there were a few factors. First of all, the Titanic, you know, for obvious reasons, we all know about that. It was glamorous and they said it would never sink, and really rich people died and were on board. Um, that had happened just 3 years before the Eastland disaster. So, and just 6 weeks before the Eastland disaster was the sinking of the Lusitania. Um,
Okay.
so that was, those were major events. And the people who died in the Eastland disaster, they were mostly immigrants and not very wealthy, and they didn't put up a lot of fuss, like they didn't make a lot of noise about it. They just wanted to quietly, mourn and deal with it in their own communities. Um, but it's still a tragedy that never should have happened. And they spent years doing a criminal investigation and they never really pinned it on any one thing. So there wasn't, any real resolution that way either.
Oh, wow. And that's what makes it even more tragic is, it's just kind of one of those, it's this confluence of a bunch of different events coming together and an example of just a tragedy that occurs in life. And so it's so interesting on how you've structured this series so that there's the 22 years in between so you could hit the different time periods.
Mhm.
So one of the questions that Lynn asked is, so you write all these different time periods. Do you have a favorite time period to write about?
I not so far. I will say that the more recent history has been so much easier to research. I
Yeah.
don't know what I was thinking when I decided to write The Mark of the King, which was set in 1720 French colonial New Orleans. I mean, I don't speak French. The primary documents are in French. That was really hard.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, the other good thing about that is like if I search and search and search for information, and if I don't find it, then it's less likely that a reader will be like, you got that wrong. Do
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
True. It's kind of, there's two sides to the coin. It's hard to find the research, but because it's hard to find it,
Yeah,
you can kind
there's
of
a
feel and
little
forget.
more leeway for imagination. But I really enjoyed writing like 1915 was drawn by the current. And right now I'm writing a new rough draft. So that's not my favorite stage, but it's set in 1925, New York City.
Oh,
And
fun.
there's so much out there. There's just so much out there. So I do love that part of it.
So that's actually a fun segue to what's your favorite part of the writing process? Because every author is a little different. Like Colleen Coble gets so giddy when she gets her edit letter, and so many authors are like, ugh, I hate that. Don't make me write my book again. You just said that, rough draft is not your favorite part. So
Mhm.
what part do you just like get like, I can't wait to sit down at my computer and do this next stage?
I think the line edits. So for those of you who might not be familiar with all of our lingo, the first time we turn in a rough draft, at least for our process with Bethany House, after a few weeks, we get the editorial memo that has pages of direction. Like they haven't marked up my manuscript, but they say things like, this character's motivation is a little weak. We need to make that stronger. Or the pacing is a little slow in this section. So, all kinds of direction, but big picture stuff. And then I spend a couple of months fixing those things. So that's the content edit. And that is very satisfying because you see a lot of progress. But then after that is the line edit. And that's when you go through with a fine-tooth comb and you make every sentence as beautiful as it can be without being, so flowery that it makes the reader stumble. But I really like to just wordsmith things and not have to worry about, oh my gosh, is this story even worth reading? By that point, I usually have the confidence that the plot is good, the characters are well developed, but I just need to make the writing sound good. So I love that part.
That's so fun, because I think that a lot of my edits have been where you get the macro and a line edit almost together. Where the editors will be like, okay, I'm catching these things as I'm doing the bigger edit. And so I always like that combo, because when my brain's working on the bigger picture ideas and kind of subconsciously going, okay, how am I going to adjust that? What is true to the characters in this story? I can start moving by crossing off some of the easy things on the line edits.
Yeah.
And so it kind of is this nice in between, where otherwise sometimes getting started on the macro is just like, ugh, there's some big boulders that have to be shifted and moved. And so I kind of like that little bit of combination between the two. So one of the things that Perrianne comments on is that she loves your attention to detail and the research that comes through. And yet you do it in a way that you're not bogging down the story. So how do you find that balance between letting us as readers, in a sense, know you've done the research, because we can fully jump in and we can believe we're in 1915 Chicago without sharing every detail that's fascinating to you when you're doing the research? And then we're like, I didn't sign up to read a nonfiction.
Right. That's a great question. And it's something that I'm always aware of when I'm writing, because we were talking earlier about the fact that I used to be a journalist and I used to write nonfiction. So I like all the facts. I like all of them. But in a novel, if they don't move the plot forward, or if they're not important to the scene, they don't need to be in there, and they will actually detract from the story. So I don't get it right in the rough draft. I'll put in too much detail on one scene because I happen to know a lot about that. And in another scene, there's not enough. So it's just, it takes a lot of conscious effort to get the balance right. And I have some readers who think that there's still too much detail, and some people just like love it. So, it's kind of nice when I have readers that have read enough of my books that they kind of know what they're getting into when they open the novel, because I don't think that I write, they're not light reads. Like they require you to be fully awake. Like, I don't know if they would be good to read right before you fall asleep, because I do put a lot in there.
Yeah, well, and that's part of helping readers know what to expect from your books.
Yeah.
So if I write a World War II historical, you should feel like you are embedded in that time period. Like I just finished doing a line edit again through Stars in the Night, because I'm re-releasing it February 1st. And it was so much fun, because I was like, oh yeah, I feel like I'm in 1942 Hollywood, and this is kind of fun. I feel like I've stepped into a black and white movie, and it should feel that way. There should be enough of the cat's pajamas and things like that kind of slogans that you feel like, okay, Clark Gable could walk in any moment and this would be kind of fun. But at the same time, it shouldn't be every other word where you're just like, I get it already.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love feeling immersed in a story. There have been books that I've read where I'm like, where am I? Like it's all dialogue, but I'm like, boop, but they're walking around on a blank canvas and I can't see their surroundings. And that drove me nuts. And then there was another book that I read. It was, and it was so much information. And I felt like I needed a dictionary. And it was like, and I know a lot of words. So like, to me, it was almost like, I feel like the author is like trying to a little too hard to prove that she's done the research. So that's kind of a good rule of thumb. Like, don't, I can put it in the author's note, or I can write a blog post. If I find something that's really fascinating, I'll just tell you all about it in a Facebook post later.
Yeah. And that's such a great way to handle it. There are these other mechanisms and vehicles now where we can dole out that, oh my gosh, this is so fascinating when I learned it. Like I'm doing all these classic Hollywood movie reviews right now because I love watching those old movies. And so then that's an easy way to convey that love without dropping every single person or movie into the book. And so finding that balance where the setting should feel like a character. It should feel like you can't just pick up the plot and the characters and move them to another location and the book still works. There needs to be enough so that it feels integrated into the story.
Yes.
But finding that balance isn't easy.
It's not easy. And I've heard a term recently, I think it was from author Elizabeth Camden. She said something about wallpaper historicals. I don't know if you've heard about this, but the idea being that like the historical era is just wallpaper in the background, but you can just like pick up the plot and put it, in different wallpaper behind you, but the wallpaper doesn't interact with the story. So that's what we don't want.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's where you do such a great job of pulling it all in. So Linda wanted to know, do you recognize your book when it comes back to you from edits?
Yeah, totally. Especially because with the content edits, like I said before, they just send me a memo and they tell me what they think I need to work on, and I do all the work. They never like just go at it with a hatchet or like rewrite things. They never do that. And even when after I do the rewrites and send it in, my my editor will, if I've done weird things like too many sentence fragments, because like that's kind of a popular thing to like start a sentence without the first word. If I've done these little things that are too trendy, she'll clean up the structure, but I've never felt like it wasn't my work anymore. But that's a good question because my experience isn't descriptive of every single author's experience. That's just my own.
Yeah, and there's this magical partnership that can happen when you've got a great editor and editorial team working with you on the book. And my goal is always to get the book as good as I know I can get it before I send it in. But knowing that because I have this team, they will help me find the gold and get rid of the dross and the stuff that's distracting or it's not working. And there have been times I've sent, I think Beyond Justice was one of them where I sent it to Amanda Bostic at Harper. And I was like, okay, this baby is fat and sassy. It was like 130,000 words. And like, I know it's got to lose a lot, but I'm so close to it right now. I can't figure out what has to come out. Mm-hmm. And so that's when the magic can start happening because then they help you. And Shadowed by Grace, Julie Gwynn was like, yeah, no, everything needs to be here. And so it wasn't that heavy. It was like 99 instead of 85, but still I was like, I know it's fat and sassy, but I just really can't figure it out. And so sometimes they'll go, yep, it's good the way it is. And other times they'll be like, yeah, we got to pull this out and how about this and give it a haircut. And the final product though, I think is almost always stronger. I mean, I've never had one where I was like, they've just gutted my baby and I don't even want my name on it.
Aw, good. I'm glad that hasn't been your experience.
Can you imagine? That would just be like,
that wouldn't be good.
Yeah. So you are a journalist and you bring that into your writing, but you also love Broadway and the musicals and things like that. So which is your favorite?
Which Broadway musical is my favorite?
Yeah.
Les Mis, hands down. And if you, for the readers who have read my Civil War series, here's a little challenge for you. I mentioned or made part of the story Les Mis in every one of those books. So like at first it was like someone like draws inspiration from Eponine, my favorite character, the most tragic character of all.
Yes.
And then after I had done that for the first two books, I was like, I'm going to keep this going, because it had just come out in 1862 and it was like a really popular book during the Civil War. So for those of you who want to give yourself a little challenge, find the Les Mis reference in all of my Civil War novels.
That is so fun. I love that. So Lynn wants to know, have your characters ever surprised you as you were writing the story?
Yes. They do that, not really, really often, but the biggest surprise I think I had was when I was writing A Refuge Assured about my French lace maker fleeing revolutionary Paris to come to America. And she was on her way, trying to escape. And her father shows up that she had never met before in her life. And I didn't even think he was going to be part of the story, but he ended up being a really big part of it. And it was this whole new arc and a whole new opportunity for redemption and reconciliation, which I love. So I didn't plan that. He just showed up. And so we went with it.
That is so fun. I think the biggest time that happened for me was actually my editor reading Beyond Justice said, oh, Savannah needs her own book. And Savannah was like the mentor character. And I was like, okay. And that became Flight Risk. But because she was a mentor character, you have some depth to them, but I did not know her because she was fulfilling a purpose and moving the story along, but not with the idea of she's going to get her own book. So then fleshing out who she was to the point she could support her own novel was so much fun. And there was so much going on in that book. And I'm like, I'm just glad Amanda was like, she needs a story, because I'm not sure I would have gone there.
That is fantastic. I love it.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that's just really, really fun about writing is even if you're a plotter and you've got everything plotted out, there are just those moments of surprise. So are you a plotter or a pantser?
Plotter.
I'm not surprised to hear you say that, but you are like adamant. So why plotter?
Because I deal with specific events in history. I feel like I have to be really specific with like when these different things happened and how it happened and where. And so I have to get my timeline, but maybe I can do a little show and tell with you.
Yeah.
So I say I'm a plotter, but I also reserve the right to change my outline and my synopsis at any point in time when I think that it's not working. So for example, I had a synopsis that I sent to my editors in order to get a new contract for this New York City book. And then I kept working on it, and then I printed it out and I cut it up and rearranged things. And I put it in a 3-ring notebook, and I'm like writing notes. Wait, hold on. Let me find a good one. And I get three, oh yeah. So I get little index cards and I write more notes. So like, it looks like a crazy person has put this notebook together, but this is like how my brain works. I mean, it's probably the same for all of us. Like, I don't think in a linear way. Like I try to, but then I get all these little pop-ups like, oh, but this has to happen before that. Like I have to insert this like 5 chapters before this, or it's not going to work out. So the more I plan, the easier it is for me to write that rough draft, which I still don't like doing because, and maybe this is true for you too, but whenever I'm working on a rough draft, I have a book that's about to release that has been worked on for a year. It is polished. It is beautiful. I am confident about that book. And then I go to my rough draft and I'm like, well, this stinks. Like there's no way that this will ever turn out anything like that. So I have to remind myself not to compare the rough draft to the finished product that is currently hitting shelves.
Oh, that's such a good point, because I think there are just those moments where I know for me, it's usually about the midpoint where I'm like, this sucks. No one's going to want to read it. My editors are going to want the advance back because this isn't working and this is awful. And then usually it's either when I'm reading it right before I turn it in that first time, or when I get it back for the line edits. And I'm like, I wrote that. that's actually okay.
Right.
And so it's been fun going back and reading my backlist as I'm putting it back up. And I was like, some of these are probably going to take a lot of rewrites. And I'm like, actually, no, I'm making tiny tweaks. But for the most part, I'm like, I'm still really proud of, the first books I wrote. And so that's been kind of a gift to go back and go, these are really good. I need to make sure I'm writing at least this well today.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So, but I think there's just always that moment where I'm like, this is awful and nobody's going to want to read it. It's just,
I think we all have, if people don't have that moment, then I just don't understand that. I feel like we all do.
Yeah. And Linda's like, I would love to read one of your rough drafts. And I'm like, no, you wouldn't.
Nope.
And you'd probably never read anything else we wrote, but I love the thought behind it. I think that's so sweet. And I'm a clean writer. I think like you, because you're a journalist, so you learned how to write quick and fast. I'm an attorney, so I had to learn to write quick and fast. And so my rough drafts are actually really clean. It's more like story stuff that we're working out versus where does this word go and where does that word go?
Oh, yeah.
And it might be, it needs a little more flavor here or a little more description there. But for the most part, it's really pretty clean. I still don't want very many. It's so vulnerable. It is so vulnerable to give that to someone and be like, here's my ugly baby.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. The ugly baby.
Yeah. So I can't believe it, but our time has already flown by.
Amazing.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. It was just so much fun to talk with you about your books and your research, and congratulations on the one that releases on February 1st.
Thank you so much. And thanks for hosting me this evening.
It was so much fun. And next week, be sure and come back because Elizabeth Goddard will be joining me as we talk about her latest romantic suspense novel. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.